Well, there's no mystery to where this one is, or is there? Welcome back to Nate the Hoof Guy. Take note once again where that mark is now and where it eventually ends up. Again, notice that mark and notice how it's moving. Now at each station on my chute, I've got multiple different knives so I can switch off in between them. For each of the front feet is one station for each of those feet, and then at the back feet, that's one station as well. I've got multiple knives there. That way it's easy. When I pick that foot up and I've got to do those first few cuts to remove some of those larger pieces, some of that debris, that's when that thick knife comes out. When I need to do some finer knife work, I just grab the other knife. When you find a big mark in a claw like this, especially one with fluid, it's pretty easy to know that you need to chase that mark down, right? The trim that's coming up next, there's a lot of big marks that you'll see in that claw, but not necessarily any of them are problematic, just based on being able to read that claw. Here you can see that mark has got some shading up underneath there. This one's definitely problematic, so we're going to keep going on that. But the size of the mark has nothing to do with necessarily the problem that's going to be underneath. In fact, some of the largest flaws you see in the claw may just be superficial marks, superficial flaws. Nothing that is actually structural that goes all the way to the corium. It's being able to read that foot and being able to see that to make those decisions on which marks you need to chase down. Notice how far this mark has moved already. I've talked many times about why these marks in the soles aren't necessarily where the lesions are, but I'll give you a quick rundown again. When we have a flaw that's happening at the corium level, that flaw will eventually start to grow out over time. So as it grows out, it's going to move down that claw as well. Now, if it's a persistent problem that's affecting that area, then over time, that mark is eventually, or that flaw that we have at the corium level is eventually going to make it all the way to the outside and be exposed to the elements, which is then going to make it susceptible, get it to having bacteria enter it and cause problems. If it's a temporary problem or a problem that just happens one time, then you may end up seeing a black mark or a mark in that sole when you trim it, but that may not necessarily travel all the way to the corium because that problem wasn't persistent. That flaw in that white line wasn't persistent over time. So you may have a flaw for a short period of time, but if that problem is resolved, then that hoof horn, those layers that follow that, are going to be sound layers, and you're not going to see any marks in those layers. So that's why you might have a situation where we trim that foot, you can see a mark, but with a few knife strokes, that mark disappears. That's because that it wasn't a persistent problem that was causing that defect in that white line. It was something that happened just one time. Maybe she slipped. Maybe that caused a little bit of a flaw where it was that hoof horn was forming there, but it wasn't something that was persistent that caused that white line to be flawed for a long period of time. So that's kind of how we read those. And I can tell usually based on what they look like, whether or not those flaws are of that nature or not. If they are a long-term problem, they tend to be a little bit wider. You can tend to see the width and depth of that crack. You can tell that it's problematic, and you can also tell based on locations. A lot of the marks we see in these claws are in locations where we don't typically find defects, so that's another thing that tips us off that they're probably not problematic. See these little white areas? That's real thin, soft hoof horn. So I got to work really carefully along those edges. Some of those I'm going to leave in place if they are in vulnerable spots. Right here is some of that soft, brand new hoof horn that's formed. Like I said, it's so soft, you don't have to worry about removing too much of this. I'm going to take some of these edges away just because there's some open space behind them that I don't want debris to get into. But typically, these are going to dehydrate and fall away really quickly within the first few days that this hoof horn is exposed. When that hoof horn is on the inside of that claw, it stays hydrated, stays soft. As soon as it works its way out and is exposed to air, then it starts to dehydrate. That's that natural shedding process that it goes through. Here you can see some of that. That's all soft hoof horn in there. I've got some edges I got to work on yet, but we're getting there. Notice where that lesion is, though. Nowhere near where we saw that first defect toward the bottom of the claw. Finishing this trim up here, all I got to do is remove some of these hard edges, any of these areas that have a little bit of overhang to them that might trap debris.